thank you so much for letting me talk about the exhibit. I also want to thank my family, and I thank the Historical Society for putting together this wonderful artifacts exhibit. My dad, I know, would be so proud of what was accomplished and what you all did, and I know it was a ton of work. And just real quick at the beginning, I want to thank Peggy and Kayla, who I'm looking at right now, but also Patrick, George, and then Mike and Don for doing the Outlaw Gunner. They did an exhibit where they talked about Mike was an outlaw gunner, and Don interviewed him during the Waterfowl Festival, and I got great feedback. So not only do a great job on the exhibit, but it was a lot of fun. So my family and I really appreciate that. And then as you kind of walk into the exhibit, it's just such a wonderful layout, and I'm struck by all the ducks and geese. And the exhibit's about my dad's book, which is called The Outlaw Gunner. And he wrote that, basically after life experiences. He was one of, 6 growing up in Chestertown area. They didn't have much money after the Depression. So they used to have to hunt and fish and do all that to survive. So it's not something that they wanted to do. And I got to say, our generations now have a lot easier than what I would call the greatest generation in their time frame. So, over the years, he got to know a lot of these market gunners, these outlaw gunners, and he was very close to these people, and he loved them, and they helped he and his family survive over time. So he wrote the book for 2 things. He was in his late 50s when he decided to write the book. When I was a kid, I remember him sitting, at his desk on the Miles River looking over the river, and he would actually put corn out. We had tons of ducks and geese would come in there, and by then he pretty much stopped hunting, and this would have been in the late 60s. He used to just love and sit there and listen to him. So he wrote the book for 2 reasons. The first reason was to preserve the heritage, and the people that he knew were all dying off by then. These people born in the late 1800s, they were starting to die off, and it made him very sad, so he wanted to preserve the history. But he also was huge by then on conservation. I think he was before his time when it comes to conservation. And so Michael Sharapa did a great, he knows my sister and is a friend of the family, but he did a great review of Dad, and in it talks about people like that. I consider my dad ahead of his time, but he's linked in with, Aldo Leopold, Teddy Roosevelt, and people like that really made an impact on conservation back then and what conservation means long term. Okay, great. So, as I mentioned earlier, the big part of the book was preserving the history, the heritage of, these people that my dad loved, and how they used to make a living and survive back in the day. And, the book says The Outlaw Gunner, and it is about the death and destruction of a lot of ducks and geese. My dad contributed quite a bit to that, but at the same time, it was a different time. You can't compare how they lived to how we live now, and it was survival, right? It helped these groups, all along the Eastern Shore, here in Talbot County, all over, provide for their families and their communities as well. So the neat thing, and you can tell I love these artifacts, about these artifacts my dad collected over the years, he would meet with these people. He would get to know a lot of the hunters, the watermen, the farmers, and in their barn they might have like an old wooden sneak skiff, or what's called a punt gun. They call them pipe guns, punt guns, a battery gun, which is 3 barrels together, a gunning light, and these are just all tools of the trade that they used. And being a doctor, a lot of times he would go out to meet these folks as he got older, and he'd give them free medical help and things along that line. And then again, he might trade them for duck decoys or trade them for artifacts. So a couple things to show you here is the first part is Dad called this the deadly combination. And it was probably, he called it the most devastating combination to kill ducks and geese at the time, was a 100-pound bag of corn, and then that's a Browning Auto 5 shotgun, Belgian Browning, and it looks like an over-under type shotgun, but it actually, the lower barrel is actually a chamber that holds an additional 12 shotgun shells. So it was probably much safer than using a punt gun or a battery gun, for sure it was. And then, you know, the ducks would be concentrated and it was a way to kill maximum amount of ducks. So a battery gun, a lot of times what they would do there is they would saw off the old flintlock barrels that by then had become obsolete, 1910, 1920, and then they would make it into one consolidated type gun with a stock, and it had a common trigger that would fire all the barrels, and the barrels were cut to different lengths to spread out the shot to, again, sounds horrible, but to kill as many ducks as possible. Now, a lot of times they would use a gunning light that you see there, and I love the gunning lights. There's a couple of great examples here, but these were used at night to kind of sneak up on the ducks. And you'll hear nowadays people do what's called jacklighting deer, but it really would work to mesmerize a flock of ducks out on the water at dusk or just as it's getting dark. They would see the light, but they were used to lights from the moon or the sun, and they weren't really afraid of them. So if they were very stealthy and quiet, they could get right up on the ducks and paddle, laying the skiff here down, and and then when they got close, fire the battery gun. And then also they would do the same thing with the punt gun. The punt gun would lay in the skiff like this, and the hunter would lay to the left of the punt gun, and the gun would protrude off the bow, maybe 4 inches, 3 inches, something like that. And then to elevate it, to get the gun up and down at the right site, they would shift forward in the skiff to get the bow down, or shift back to get the bow up. And then they had these cool little hand paddles that were tied they would use to pivot the skiff. They were very quiet. And then with that, in the back, most important, they would have burlap bags like that filled with straw, whatever, and that would cushion the blow, because when they pulled the trigger, they would slap that trigger on the punt gun. The punt gun would recoil, and instead of going through the side of the skiff, which would be very life-threatening, the gun would slide through, hit the burlap bags full of straw, and then recoil back. And again, a devastating way to shoot ducks and geese. And then this is really cool. That's a very rare ramrod for putting shot and things like that in the punt. So there are a couple of really good stories in the book. If you should read The Outlaw Gunner when you get a chance. And one of my favorite stories is that really, I think, captures the essence of why these market gunners, these watermen, these farmers did what they did. It talks about Holland's Island, which, if you know the story of Holland's Island, is all underwater now. But back in the day, 1900 or so, there were hundreds of people, watermen, that lived on Holland's Island. And they fished, they hunted, they oystered, and they and they market gun ducks and geese during the day. So the story is about how there were 4 sneak skiffs and 4 punt guns, which I just showed you earlier, that were on the island that were owned by various watermen. And so all day long during this time, it was early, ducks really hadn't come into the Chesapeake Bay yet, but it was getting colder. So these watermen would be out there tonging for oysters, still getting fish late in the season. And one day they're out there in skipjacks and things like dredging for oysters, and they notice a bunch of ducks coming in. And as they're sailing, they talk about sailing through rafts that were a half-mile long, a mile wide or whatever, full of redheads, canvasbacks, and things like that, which are very good eating ducks. So that night they all get together, they've got their 4 sneak skiffs together, and they talk about, in the book, my dad changes the names of the people, but it's a true story. And he called them like a pack of wolves chasing after their prey, because all of a sudden these 4, just as it's getting dark, they follow the setting moon, and there are 4 sneak skiffs going out with punt guns, and they all knew how to hunt and shoot, and I don't know how many thousands of ducks they killed that night. But it was a big deal back in the day, and the reason it was a big deal for these watermen was because of the price of ducks and geese at the time. So you can figure around 1900, 1910, and there's a great price list in the book that you'll see, and it's here in the exhibit. And it actually comes from, I didn't know she was going to be my wife at the time, but Lynn Shanahan and her father Her grandfather was George Bailey, who hunted a hunting lodge on Poplar Island way back in the 50s or so. And that price list came from them. So just a little shout out to my wife's family. But one of the big things you'll see if you look at the price list, for like a pair of canvasbacks, it was like $4, $4.50, which, geez, that's 110 years ago. So can you imagine killing 2,000-3,000 ducks and getting $4, $4.50 a pair? Redheads were a little bit smaller, maybe $3.50 a pair. So what they would do is they would shoot them all. They'd put them in the skiffs. The skiff would be full, or they'd tie them behind and bring them all back. And again, I know it sounds horrible, but let's just think about, where these folks were during the day. And then they'd put them all on a skipjack or a sailboat, and they'd sail them up to Baltimore. They'd get them shipped to Philadelphia or New York to sell. And not only did it benefit, the watermen there, but it benefited the whole island. They would share these, what they made from shooting ducks and geese. So market gunning, there was a change from market gunning to what we call outlaw gunning, hence the name of the book, okay? And it was 1918 or so, Migratory Bird Treaty Act came about. And, thankfully, it was Fish and Wildlife, the government stepping in to try and limit the number of ducks and geese, because even way back then, they were depleting, the species. The number of ducks were not like they used to be, this is 100 years ago. So something had to be done to control the slaughter of ducks and geese. So the Eastern Shore folks are a hardy breed, and they may not have, appreciated that as much at the time. So bowed down on them, Smith Island, Hollins Island, Dorchester County, Hooper's Island, even Tillman Island, where I live, there was still a hardy bunch of market gunners or outlaw gunners. And that still did this. I mean, these people were risking their lives, going out in the cold water. There are tons of stories of market gunners or watermen that didn't come back from a hunting trip. So, but why would they do that? Even when it's illegal, there was still a ready market in Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia to buy their ducks and geese. So it might be a little more, clandestine, if you will. But there was a ready market even after they were trying to put an end to this type of shooting. And on the Eastern Shore, and this is during my dad's lifetime, there were still a lot of people right up into the 50s or 60s that hunted, that did this, that still made money shooting ducks and geese. So where it may have been stopped in New York, all along Virginia, North Carolina, on the Chesapeake Bay, not to say some of these folks are descendant of pirates, I might be as well, but there was still a ready market, and they still did that. As a matter of fact, I have a friend on Tillman Island that tells me he still hears a punt gun go off from time to time. Like, well, I doubt that, but you never know. So one of the great exhibits that the Historical Society put together is a display of old duck decoys. Decoys were used in a variety of different capacities depending on the way you hunted. And what's really neat about these is there's a couple of those that I'll talk about in a second, but there's several of these that go back to the Civil War era. So as you can imagine, some of these duck decoys are 120, 150 years old or so. And, as my father was collecting punt guns, battery guns, and other neat stuff that we've talked about, he amassed a huge collection of duck decoys. And he just had hundreds of them. They weren't grown up as a kid. In our basement, there were decoys everywhere. There were punt guns, gunning lights, and things like this. And as I've gotten older, I really appreciate the duck decoys because it's a lot easier to have those on your shelf versus a sneak skiff or something. So one of the hunting techniques we did not talk about that I have a couple of decoys that are worth mentioning is what's called a sink box. And a sink box just really quickly looks like somebody's coffin sitting on the surface of the water. And then it had wings that laid out. There's a couple cool pictures this Historical Society has of Dick Tillman and some other folks hunting around 1910 on the Wye River, Talbot County, which is great. And it's one of the really, really good breakdown of about 4 or 5 pictures of what they did that day hunting and how they used to do that. And so what you'll see here, there are 2 what are called wing ducks. And again, just have a vision of a coffin with somebody sitting in it. But then they had wooden wings that stuck out to keep the coffin from sinking. And that way they could lay in it. And it was very stealthy. They could lay down in it and the ducks wouldn't see them. And around the sink box would be a bunch of decoys. So the ducks would see that and they wouldn't see the hunter until it was too late. So on the most valuable decoys are what are called wooden wing ducks. And so what they would do is they actually had iron duck decoys that would hold the wings down in the water, if you can think about that. But then they also had wooden wing ducks, and these are made by a guy in Havre de Grace by Bob McCall. And they're really cool. They're wooden and they would be tied to the sink box. And again, it was just to kind of hide the hunter. And then sink box hunting, particularly Havre de Grace area, was a big deal. You'll hear a lot about that. So there were a rig of those that were half, their bottoms cut off. It would lay on the wooden sink box. There were others. This is part of the rig. Again, there would be hundreds of these wooden duck decoys out there. So the ducks would come in and land. There's what's called a John Duck decoy, which is really cool. And what they would do is they would drill a hole. And here's a great example by a guy by the name of Jim Holly from that area. And you'll see an old anchor in there with the rope. And basically they would drill a hole in the decoy. And then when they were finished for the day and they took the sink box up and everything, basically it was afloat. So the next day they'd know where they wanted to put it. There'd be this decoy there just sitting as a float. So those are very rare. Those are really cool. Now this one, I don't know, it has a pretty cool history, but that's the one, if you can see it. Doesn't have any paint on it. Probably my favorite decoy that Dad collected, but it's got to go back to the 1850s, 1860s or so. Most people are familiar with Madison Mitchell, and that's an old Madison Mitchell pintail decoy from the 1920s. Dad, when he was in North Carolina, collected that what was called a battery decoy. They called a sink box a battery down there. And these are old battery decoys. And then here's one, a brant decoy, that was hunted like typically where you would have a duck blind and a rig of decoys. And that was made by a guy by the name of Miles Hancock. So there's some pretty cool examples here. And the other thing that I want to show, they also use what are called live decoys. Okay, so a little bit different, but Dad used to say nobody calls a duck in like a live duck or a live goose. So what they would do is they would tether, these would be their pets. And there's a guy by the name of Tom Reed. They used to do presentations down in Chesapeake, and he used to raise ducks for using as live decoys when it was legal. It was outlawed along with corn and other things, I think in the 1920s, 1930s. But if you look here, there's a couple of stakes, and they just look like wooden stakes with a rope on them. But the rope actually at the end has like a little tether to hold the duck's leg. And what they would do is they would sink them in the mud in front, and they'd have live decoys walking around calling, and then they would have real wooden decoys out there. And it was in a very effective way of hunting. Dad used to, in the book, there's a story, if a duck didn't cooperate very long out there, then or didn't cooperate, it wasn't long before he was in the pot to eat. But others were, it was tough if you were a live decoy. The one other before I stopped talking about decoys is Tom Reed used to do, when I was a kid, I saw it. He used to do this great discussion, and he had a rig of what are decoys by a famous carver in Chesapeake by the name of Ira Hudson. And he had over the limit decoys. So you'll see, I don't have any, I wish I did. I think they have them at the Museum of Chesapeake. But the bottom, it was hollowed out goose decoy, and the bottom of it would slide back and forth. It was just a little piece of plywood. And then what the hunter would do is if they shot over their limit, they would have a rig of these, and before the game warden came, they'd go in there, shove the goose or the duck over the limit of the decoy and put it back out. And so it looked like they didn't have it, but that's the way an over the limit decoy worked.
Great.
So after writing The Outlaw Gunner in 1971, by 1972, 1973, I think there were some 40,000 copies of the book, which to me is incredible for terms back then. So the book was a huge success, and my dad had amassed like I mentioned earlier, this massive collection of decoys, guns, artifacts, and I think he felt pretty good about preserving the history. And what he did then was he gave half of it to the Maritime Museum, and they ended up decoys, guns, a lot of that stuff to preserve. They've done a wonderful job with that. And he gave the other half to the Fish and Wildlife Service, which was so neat about this exhibit is some of that stuff has been sitting in, in a government warehouse. And then we were able to work with them, Steve Fleury and a couple of Mark Madison, to get some of the skiffs and things out of the storage. They hadn't seen the light of day in 50 years since Dad gave them the stuff in 1970 when the book was written. But the other part of it that he had, and it was probably just as important, if not more, was it's pretty much stopped hunting by then. If you can imagine 1970 or so, after years of hunting, he wanted to do more to preserve, habitat. And again, I feel like he was way ahead of his time, like we talked about in the very beginning. Something needed to be done to preserve waterfowl habitat, things along that line. So he and a group of concerned citizens in Talbot County, Easton, friends of his, Fish and Wildlife, Ducks Unlimited, people like that all got together, and they came up with the idea in 1971 for the first Waterfowl Festival. So, I think that was a fitting kind of tribute to we got the book, so what are we going to do to preserve the ducks, and geese and things like that. So they came up with the first Waterfowl Festival, and here on display that my father had with some of his chicken scratch notes, he was a doctor, so his handwriting was horrible, were the first, he was the chairman of the first steering committee, but there were a ton of people, 15 or so, even more than that. It really took a village to put together this. So a lot of the first year or two exhibits were things from my dad from the collection here. You went to Easton High School back then, you were going to see a punt gun, sneak skiff. You would see the stuff that he gave Fish and Wildlife, I think the Maritime Museum as well. Here's a decoy that was signed by all the first people on the steering committee and given to Dad. Dad gave me that when I was a little kid. The first Waterfowl Festival booklet, there have been how many, 54 or so, something along that line. That's the first poster that my mom saved. I got it framed. And then the Waterfowl Festival, Dina and the folks over there also gave some cool history from the Waterfowl Festival at the time. So it was a very important start to try and preserve the habitat. Since then, last year, I have to check, but I think over $6 million worth of contributions to groups like Ducks Unlimited, various other nonprofits for preserving ducks and geese long term. So I think that's a fitting, tribute to my dad and his book and his vision, not only preserving our heritage, but then long term, what can they do for conservation?